France, 1429. A young maiden, who claims to be a messenger from God, is brought forth at the royal castle of Chinon. The heir to the French throne, Charles the Dauphin, fearful of assassination, hides amongst his courtiers. But when the young girl enters the hall, she throws herself at his knees, proclaiming, "God give you a happy life, sweet king." Is the girl an agent of the devil, sent to lead the French astray? Or has this child from Lorraine been sent to fulfill the prophecy that an armoured maiden would rise to rescue France from the grip of the English invaders? Before we begin, a quick word from our sponsors, Babbel, the world's #1 language learning app. Ever wanted to learn a new language, but find the prospect daunting? Then Babbel is a learning tool for you, as it prepares you for real-world conversations you will encounter, whether you're traveling, visiting another country on business, or simply planning a vacation. For example, we've been learning French.
J'adore apprendre le français en utilisant Babbel. C'est incroyable.
Click the link in the video description to sign up today and get 50% off Babbel for 6 months for a limited time only. The woman known to history as Joan of Arc was born on approximately the 6th of January, 1412, in the small village of Domremy, in the northeast of central France. Her parents, Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romet, were farmers who owned a moderate portion of land, about 50 acres, and Jacques was also a minor village official, involved in local tax collection as well as being a member of the village watch. And although Joan was not taught to read or write, her pious mother instilled her with a deep affection for the Catholic Church and its teachings. Joan was born in the midst of the 100 Years' War, a conflict which had ravaged France for over 70 years at the time of her birth, and a conflict which would become inextricably intertwined with the life of Joan. Not only would the 100 Years' War shape Joan of Arc, but she would greatly shape the outcome of the war and become one of the most iconic figures of the conflict. The origins of the 100 Years' War lay in the death of King Charles IV of France, who died without a male heir in 1328, and his appointment of Philip, Count of Valois, Anjou and Maine, as his successor. Philip was a great-grandson of Saint Louis IX and was the king's first cousin, and the French nobility quickly acknowledged Philip as the rightful king of France. However, Philip's claim to the throne was contested, as Charles IV's sister Isabella was Queen of England and mother of Edward III, thus making Edward Charles's closest male relative. But the French nobles did not want to see the King of England ascend to the French throne. Furthermore, France claimed Salic law, an ancient Frankish law code that excluded claimants to the throne if their claim was through a woman, to argue that Edward's case was illegitimate, based as it was on his mother Isabella. In 1328, Edward III was only 15 years old, and England was effectively ruled by his mother and her lover Roger Mortimer. The two were focused on securing control of a country, riven by noble revolts, after Isabella and Mortimer had deposed and killed Edward II in 1327. Therefore, Edward III's claim was not pressed upon Charles's death, and Philip VI was able to ascend to the throne securely. However, in 1330, Edward III overthrew Isabella and Mortimer and took personal control of England, and although the early years of his personal rule were dominated by his campaigns against the Scots, tensions with the French king soon arose, beginning in 1334 when Philip made an alliance with King David of Scotland, and they reached a head on the 24th of May 1337 when Philip announced the seizure of Gascony from the English. Gascony was a province in the southwestern corner of France and was the last remaining English-owned territory on the continent, following the decline of Henry II's Angevin Empire, which once made up the whole of western France. Edward responded in October 1337 by asserting his claim to the throne of France, and thus began the 100 Years' War, a series of conflicts that would last 116 years between two kingdoms whose fates had been intertwined in many ways since the Norman conquest of England in 1066. But France would suffer terribly during this period, and it is this suffering of ordinary French peasants that would ultimately lead to the rise of a peasant girl who would change French fortunes when the country was on its knees. The opening phase of the war saw substantial English success, with Edward III leading his armies to a crushing naval victory at Sluys in 1340, and then on land at Crécy in 1346, the traditional French tactics of heavy cavalry charges being destroyed by the English longbow. Furthermore, the English king's eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, won another victory at Poitiers, capturing the French king Jean II in the process. And in 1360, the English and French signed the Treaty of Bretigny, giving the English king possession of the Duchy of Aquitaine, a vast territory equivalent to approximately 1/3 of France's land area. The next 20 years, however, saw a steady decline in English fortunes, as Edward III and the Black Prince became increasingly crippled by illness, and the new King of France, the cunning and intelligent Charles V, set about reviving France and regaining the territory lost to the English in the 1360 treaty. After rebuilding the French monarch's army and restoring financial control, Charles utilized tactics of scorched earth and guerrilla raids to gradually push the English out of Aquitaine, avoiding open battle and encouraging the Aquitanian peoples to rebel against their English overlords. Indeed, by the time of Edward III's death in 1377, the English had lost all the territory they had gained since the start of the conflict, with the exception of Calais, and Charles V died 3 years later, leaving the war in stalemate. English ascendancy having been toppled, yet France unable to completely expel their enemy from the continent. Edward III and Charles V were succeeded by underaged rulers, Richard II of England and Charles VI of France, and a peace was agreed between the rulers in 1389 at the Truce of Loylingham. The war now entered a lull for about 25 years, as England and France suffered significant internal unrest. In England, Richard II soon antagonized the English nobility, with the elevation of his despised favourites, Michael de la Pole and Robert de Vere, causing the formation of the Lords Appellant in 1387, a group of nobles who forced the execution of these favourites and bolstered the power of Parliament. It was Richard's harsh reprisal to this, 10 years later, in what historians label the tyranny, that led to his downfall from the English throne, as Richard had the Lords Appellant executed, imprisoned for life or exiled, and removed all restraints to his power, and this led to Henry of Bolingbroke, a grandson of Edward III through John of Gaunt, and a member of the Lancastrian house, to return from his exile in France and overthrow Richard in August of 1399. Richard received virtually no support from the nobility due to the unpopularity of his tyrannical rule, and Bolingbroke was crowned as Henry IV on the 13th of October. Henry IV's 14-year reign was dominated by internal rebellions, such as an uprising in Wales led by Owen Glendower, which was joined by Harry Hotspur, the first Earl of Northumberland, and thus the English did not launch a concerted campaign into France during his reign. Indeed, the turmoil seen in England since the ascension of Richard II was matched by the internal unrest in France following the 1389 Truce of Loylingham. In July 1392, the French King Charles VI suffered a bout of insanity whilst riding through a forest, slaying 4 of his entourage, and from here onwards the king suffered repeated episodes of severe mental illness during his reign, at times forgetting his name or the fact that he was king, and at one point became convinced that he was made of glass and that he would shatter if he came into contact with another person. Having this unstable king on the throne opened France up to factional intrigue, as ambitious nobles vied to exercise influence over the Regency Council and the country as a whole. 2 nobles in particular rose to prominence in the early 15th century: John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy and a cousin of the king, and Louis, Duke of Orleans and brother to the king, and the two were opposed to each other in virtually every important policy matter, with the Duke of Orleans supportive of the Avignon Pope and fiercely opposed to the English, whilst Burgundy supported the Roman Pope and favoured reconciliation rather than war with the English. In the first decade of the 15th century, Louis of Orleans was the dominant influence on the Regency Council. However, in 1407, the tensions between the Burgundians and Orleanists exploded when Louis was murdered on the streets of Paris, a brutal crime that John the Fearless publicly claimed as his own doing. As a result, France descended into civil war. with Louis of Orleans' son Charles forming an alliance with his father-in-law, the Count of Armagnac, who assembled an anti-Burgundian league which became known as the Armagnac Party. Whilst the Armagnacs were supported by the majority of royal officials and nobles outside of John's territories, the Burgundians drew their strength from the Parisian bourgeoisie and academics, and in 1408 John took control of Paris, promising reform and lowering the high taxes imposed by Louis of Orleans. However, he was forced to leave the city in August 1413 when the Parisians appealed to the Armagnacs against John's brutal suppression of political opponents, and the Armagnac forces reclaimed Paris, led by the heir to the French throne, Charles VI's son, the Dauphin Louis. The France that Joan of Arc was born into, in 1412, was thus divided and lacking strong leadership, and the country's troubles were about to get far worse, as a new English king ascended to the throne in 1413, Henry V, who rapidly united his country under his kingship and set about resuming the 100 Years' War by reclaiming his right to the throne of France. In August of 1415, Henry of England sailed for France, where he laid siege to and captured the port town of Harfleur in northern France, though in doing so his army was struck by dysentery, which killed or invalidated about 4,000 of his 12,000-strong army. Nevertheless, the English army marched east towards Calais and were met on their march by a much larger French force near the village of Agincourt, resulting in one of the most famous battles in medieval history, as Henry's troops won a crushing victory over the French, inflicting thousands of casualties, including many major nobles and members of the royal household, with prominent Armagnacs and Burgundians falling side by side on the field of battle. The effects of Agincourt were devastating for France. Instead of uniting the noble factions, the shocking defeat sent France spiraling even deeper into civil war, whilst an emboldened Henry V used his opponent's chaos to launch another campaign in Normandy in 1417. This time the king did not seek battle, but conquest, and over the next 3 years the English strategically subdued the major towns and cities of Normandy through siege warfare, so that by 1420 Henry was the master of the entire province. Indeed, in this year Henry signed the Treaty of Troyes. This affirmed English supremacy in the war by proclaiming Henry V as heir to the French throne, to ascend upon the death of Charles VI, and by allowing Henry to marry Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois. Meanwhile, as the English conquered Normandy and claimed the French throne, the French Civil War increased in intensity, with the Burgundians retaking Paris on the 29th of May 1418, leading to the death of the Count of Armagnac. But despite this incident, it appeared that the relentless progress of Henry through Normandy in 1418-19 could have led to a reconciliation between the factions against a common English enemy. However, this hope was crushed when John of Burgundy was murdered at a meeting with the Dauphin Charles, who was part of the Armagnac party, and his entourage on the 10th of September 1419. This brutal act ensured that there could be no reconciliation between the Burgundians and Armagnacs. For John the Fearless's son Philip, the new 23-year-old Duke of Burgundy, the betrayal and murder of his father led him to finally do what the Burgundians had considered for many years: join an alliance with King Henry of England. Thus, in the aforementioned Treaty of Troyes, the Burgundians promised to support Henry's claim to the throne, in return for Henry's help in conquering Armagnac-controlled territory. Following the treaty, Henry and Philip of Burgundy continued the conquest of northern France, so that by 1422, most of France north of the River Loire was under Henry's control, whilst Paris was under Anglo-Burgundian occupation. And so, at this point, in 1422, the Dauphin Charles and his Armagnac supporters appeared to be in dire straits, and from his court in Bourges, the Dauphin attempted to shore up his support in southern France, though the 19-year-old lacked the military and leadership talents of his English adversary. However, the Dauphin's cause received a boost when Henry V contracted dysentery whilst besieging the town of Mons, and died on the 31st of August 1422 at the age of just 35. 2 months later, on the 21st of October, Charles VI of France also died, leaving Henry's infant son just 9 months old as Henry VI of England and Henry II of France, and Henry V's brother John, Duke of Bedford, was made regent of France to rule on his infant nephew's behalf. The Dauphin now proclaimed himself as Charles VII, However, English ascendancy did not immediately die with its king, as Bedford was an extremely capable soldier and ruler, and on the 17th of August 1424, he comprehensively defeated a Franco-Scottish force loyal to the Dauphin at the Battle of Verneuil in Normandy. Though the English were outnumbered almost 2-1, and an initial cavalry charge broke through the English archers, the men-at-arms had stood their ground and were able to break the enemy line when the archers regrouped and helped overwhelm the French and the Scots. With this decisive victory, Bedford had once again crushed the hopes of the Armagnacs, and in 1424 it seemed clearer than ever that two Frances had emerged, one in the north loyal to the English and Burgundians, ruled from the Norman capital of Rouen by Bedford, who forbid any of Henry VI's subjects from referring to the Dauphin as king or to the Armagnacs as French, and one in the south, presided over by Charles in Bourges, who was desperate for an inspirational military leader to whom his supporters could rally. Charles himself was not skilled enough militarily, nor charismatic enough to perform this role, and he was too valuable for his life to be risked in battle, as the last surviving son of Charles VI. In the summer of 1428, the English began an offensive along the Loire River, south of which lay the territories loyal to the Dauphin, and on October 12th, Thomas Montague, 4th Earl of Salisbury, began the siege of Orleans, a strategically important city on the north bank of the Loire, which, if taken, would allow the English to make a decisive push into Armagnac territory and break the stalemate of the war which had persisted for the previous 5 years. However, just over 2 weeks after the siege began on the 27th of October, Salisbury died after being struck by debris from a French cannon shot, and his death was disastrous for the English, who lost a talented and respected commander early on in the important siege, and his replacement was the less able Earl of Suffolk. The English were too few to form a stranglehold around the large town, and their bombardment did little damage against the extensive fortifications of Orleans. Thus, as winter arrived in early 1429, the situation at the siege of Orleans mirrored that in the country as a whole, an attritional stalemate between implacable foes, both of whom, after the deaths of their monarchs, lacked an inspirational leader to rally them. It was in these dark winter months, when the fate of France hung in the balance, and the Dauphin had even made plans to retreat to the far southeast if Orleans fell, that a band of 6 armed men arrived at the castle of Chinon on the 23rd of February, and with them rode a girl who was dressed as a boy, with her hair cut short. And this girl's name was Joan, who insisted that she had been told by God to deliver France from her misery and win back the country for the Dauphin. Since the age of 13, Joan of Arc had seen and heard voices of heavenly beings, which she took to be saints, such as Michael and Catherine, amongst others, and these visions and voices told her to take up actions against the English and drive them out of France and install the Dauphin to the throne. By the spring of 1428, the 16-year-old asked her uncle to take her to the town of Vaucouleurs, a Dauphinist stronghold, where she asked the town garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, for an armed escort, so that she could travel to the French court at Chinon to counsel the Dauphin, and convince him of her God-given message to lead the armies of France against the English, and crown Charles as King of France at Rheims, a city in northern France whose cathedral had been the site of every coronation since the first Frankish king, Clovis. Baudricourt rejected her, but she returned again in January 1429, determined to relieve the besieged city of Orleans, and convinced several soldiers to help her, proclaiming that she must be at the king's side. There will be no help, if not from me. I would rather have remained spinning wool at my mother's side, yet I must go and do this thing, for my lord will that I do so. She was then given a second meeting with Baudricourt, at which she predicted that the Dauphin's forces would lose a military confrontation with the English near the town of Rouvray, north of Orleans, where the French attempted to intercept a supply column destined for the English forces besieging Orleans. After word had reached the garrison commander at Vaucouleurs of the dire situation for the French at Orleans in the winter of early 1429, Baudricourt agreed to grant Joan an escort to the royal court at Chinon, and she then travelled through hostile territory, which was controlled by Burgundian troops, disguised as a man, wearing men's clothing and with her dark hair cut short. There had been widespread rumours and prophecies for years that an armoured maiden would rise from the Lorraine region of France, which is where Joan was born, and rescue the country from the English invaders. Whether Joan used this to her advantage, no one knows, but these rumours certainly helped her to convince those in French court of her legitimacy. Joan then arrived at the castle of Chinon on the 23rd of February 1429. The Dauphin had heard all about Joan's prediction, and so sought to test her by disguising himself as one of his entourage. Upon entering the chamber, Joan threw herself at Charles's feet, despite never having met him before, holding him tightly around his knees, crying, "God give you a happy life, sweet king." Yet Charles and his advisors viewed Joan with a high degree of caution, as this extraordinary girl could, in their view, just as easily be an agent of evil, sent by Satan to lead France to her ruin as an agent of God. Joan was inspected and questioned by theologians, clergymen, and members of the Dauphin's court, and even sent south to Poitiers to be questioned by the greatest gathering of theologians in Armagnac, France. And after weeks of investigation, she was found to be devout, pious, and virtuous, and above all, certain of the message God had sent her. And the Dauphin was advised by his theologians that the girl should be allowed to lead a force to relieve the siege at Orleans, as she insisted, and should she succeed, they argued, this would be a vindication of her claims of divine intervention, and France would truly have been delivered a heavenly agent to lead them to victory. Before setting off for Orleans on the 22nd of March, Joan dictated a letter to the English enemy, warning Bedford, or as she labelled him, "You who call yourself regent of the Kingdom of France," that she had been sent by God to rid the English from France, and in this letter she styled herself as the Maid. Thus, Joan of Arc would become known to posterity as the Maid of Orleans. Joan labelled herself as the Maid because the French word for maid, pucelle, comes from the Latin word puella, which connotes a chaste virgin, and emphasizing her virginity greatly enhanced Joan's saintliness and divine purity at that time. As Joan prepared to travel to Orleans, the Dauphin's court mobilized its propaganda machine to ensure that every region of France that Armagnac diplomacy could reach was informed of this heavenly saviour, with secretaries searching through ancient manuscripts to find prophecies of Joan's coming to legitimize her claims. Charles's mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, had been assembling and supplying a relief force to send to Orleans, which Joan was to join. She was crafted a full suit of armour from the Dauphin's master armourer, and a painter was commissioned to design banners for the Maid, which depicted a golden fleur-de-lis across a white field with plenty of religious imagery. Then, on the morning of the 26th of April 1429, Joan rode with the relief force northeast towards Orleans. This small army, which was comprised of a few thousand soldiers, set off between the 27th and 28th of April, carrying supplies for the city. The entourage resembled a religious procession, rather than an armed force, with Joan at its head, who sent messages to the English garrison surrounding Orleans, ordering them, in the name of God, to be gone, or I will make you go. Joan had wanted to approach Orleans through English-held territory from the north, but the convoy's commander, Marshal Jean de Brosse, decided against such a move, and instead approached the city from the south without informing Joan. Upon discovering that she had been deceived, Joan was livid, and immediately ordered an attack on the nearest English positions, but was eventually forced to accept that the resupply of the city was the more pressing concern, and she then accompanied the supplies into the city, under the cover of darkness by boat, on the evening of the 29th of April, where she helped to raise morale by parading through the streets and distributing provisions. Over the coming days, Joan had heated exchanges with the other French military leaders about the plan of action, and after the city's commander, John of Dunois, left to gather reinforcements, Joan proceeded to inspect the English fortifications, while simultaneously shouting at the enemy soldiers, as well as one of the commanders of the English forces at the Tyrol, William Glasdale, that they should surrender to God, an action which was met with considerable scorn and insult from the English troops. On the 3rd of May, Dunois returned with his reinforcements, which entered the city from the north, unmolested due to their numbers, and the next day Dunois led an attack on one of the English bastilles in order to secure the safe passage of another supply convoy. And although Joan was not informed of the attack, as she was sleeping when it began, she soon joined the successful assault, during which Joan did not spill any English blood, but rather rode with the troops carrying her banner, rallying them to fight. 2 days later, the French defenders resolved to concentrate their efforts on the main bulk of the English forces on the south bank of the river, around the fortifications known as the Tourelle. If Joan could drive the English out of this stronghold, then the siege of Orleans would be raised. Thus, when dawn came on the 6th of May, Joan took confession and attended mass with her soldiers, and Joan, her men, as well as the people of Orleans, were immensely hopeful and confident of victory, for they truly believed that God was with them in their mission to liberate France from English rule. Crossing the Loire, Joan and a French military leader known as La Hire led a fierce cavalry charge that pushed back the enemy and allowed the French to capture a key component of the Tourelle, an English fortress built around the monastery of Les Augustins, after a full day of bloody combat, allowing the remaining English forces to be surrounded by French soldiers. The next day, the 7th of August, the French renewed their assault on the Tourelle, although the initial attacks broke against formidable English defences, and as the Armagnac troops began to tire, Joan herself was hit by an English arrow between her neck and shoulder, and at the sight of their divine leader wounded, the French began to falter. However, the injury was a flesh wound, and Joan defiantly raised her banner and pressed forwards towards the walls of the fortress, rallying her men, who began to climb the scaling ladders to the ramparts. The English were gripped with fear at the rejuvenated French advance, and their situation worsened when the English captain William Gladsdale lost his footing and fell, fully armoured, into the river and drowned, causing panic to spread amongst the surrounded English, and by the end of the day, the Tourelle was captured by the Armagnac forces. The English lost nearly 1,000 killed and 600 captured troops during the fighting, and now that the Tourelle at the end of the bridge to Orleans was in French hands, the city could be resupplied with ease from the south, meaning that any continuation of the siege was pointless. And as Joan and her army re-entered the city on the evening of the 7th of May, they were greeted by jubilant crowds and the ringing of church bells in celebration at the miraculous victory that the Maid had secured, just days after arriving at the siege of Orleans. Although the English grip on Orleans had been broken, their army remained in the field surrounding the town. Thus, on the 8th of May, Joan and her captains led their army outside Orleans to face the English, who appeared to be preparing for battle. However, after about an hour, during which the two armies faced one another in anticipation, the English commanders gave the orders to withdraw, and their forces left Orleans, officially ending the 6-month siege. Joan's actions at the siege of Orleans secured her fame throughout France, and indeed Europe. And although her arrival at the siege coincidentally coincided with a change in French tactics, in which they took the offensive against the English, there is little doubt that Joan's arrival and presence at Orleans had a considerable effect on all concerned, both lifting the French morale and inspiring the town's population, soldiers, and commanders to greater endeavours. Joan's victory at Orleans was so vital for Armagnac morale, not just because of the town's strategic importance or the damage caused to English morale, but because it was widely seen as proof that God was on the side of the Dauphin's cause, and that the Maid, Joan of Arc, was indeed an agent of God. Thus, as they were certain that God's will was now in their favour, the French felt that triumph over the English was inevitable, and this rallied the nobles and commoners alike to the Dauphin's side. The next problem, which faced Joan and the French, was that the bridge connecting Orleans to the south bank of the Loire had been destroyed during the fighting, and they would have to secure other crossing points across the river in order to aid their advance northwards, as well as prevent any English advance south. Joan's aim was now to clear the remaining English strongholds along the Loire River, to allow the French to travel north in order to reach Reims, where Joan's mission to oversee the anointing and crowning of the Dauphin Charles as Charles VII of France could be completed, as only through a coronation at Reims Cathedral could Charles's claim to kingship achieve legitimacy. Indeed, the English had taken and fortified 3 bridges across the Loire, at Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beauchancy, and the French now resolved to retake them. This culminated in Joan winning her first offensive victories, and in the French winning a string of victories against the previously dominant English forces. After a month of preparations for the campaign, during which the Maid of Orleans was able to develop her skills on horseback and wielding weapons of war, the French set out for the English stronghold of Jargeau, 10 miles upstream from Orleans, and Joan was joined on this campaign by capable military leaders such as John of Dunois, commander of the French defences at Orleans, La Hire, an extremely talented military leader whose real name was Etienne de Vigneul, and rarely for 15th century military leaders in France, was not a noble. But he was one of Joan's strongest supporters and admirers. Also present was the young Duke of Alençon, a royal prince whose father had been killed at Agincourt, and who became good friends with Joan. Alençon was technically in command of the campaign, however it was Joan's conviction, charisma, and semi-divine status that drove and inspired the army. On the 11th of June 1429, the French laid siege to the Earl of Suffolk's forces at Jargeau, pushing back the English troops to behind the town's walls, and the next day Joan led an assault on the town, where, just as at Orleans, she was knocked down by an English projectile, this time a rock thrown at her head, but again she recovered and rallied her troops to victory, with the French capturing the Earl of Suffolk and forcing the garrison to capitulate. 3 days later, on the 15th of June, the French laid siege to 2 more English positions, with crossings over the Loire River at Meung-sur-Loire and Beaugency, and these both fell on the 18th of June as the English forces withdrew to the north. They had initially been bolstered by the arrival of reinforcements from Paris under Sir John Fastolf. However, when combined with the men from the garrisons of Meung and Beaugency under Lord Talbot, the English had approximately 3,000 troops compared to the Dauphinists' approximate 8,000. These were bad odds for the English, although they had achieved greatness with even worse odds in the past at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. Consequently, the fact that they were outnumbered, combined with the fear-invoking reputation of any army led by Joan of Arc, prompted the English commanders to withdraw towards the north. But Joan was determined to follow them, and so the English were closely pursued by the Armagnac forces until the French caught up with the English near the village of Patay. The ensuing battle saw the English attempt to deploy the same static tactics they used at Crécy and Agincourt, forming up their archers behind sharpened stakes in order to mow down the advancing French. Talbot also attempted to lay a trap for the enemy by moving troops into a tree line at the side of a road, down which the opposition were approaching. But the English failed to complete their preparations in time, and thus the charging French soldiers were not met with the intended hail of arrows, and so were able to storm the confused English lines and rout the entirety of the English army, resulting in the largest defeat the English had suffered in France in decades, losing nearly 2,500 troops out of an army of 5,000, and, after the battle, Lord Talbot himself was captured, but Sir John Falstaff managed to flee the field and return home, where he was used as a scapegoat for the defeat. Patay had dire consequences for the English, as the majority of their forces in central France had been destroyed and defeated, meaning that they were now unable to put up any kind of serious defence against the French over the coming months. Furthermore, Joan and her army had now pushed the Dauphin's kingdom across the Loire and into English France, and all this had been achieved in just 7 weeks from Joan's arrival at Orleans. Following the Battle of Patay, Joan was determined to take Charles deep into enemy territory to Reims, where he could be officially crowned as the King of France, despite the city being under Anglo-Burgundian control. And on the 29th of June, the Dauphin and his court, led by Joan and her army, left Bourges and travelled north. Indeed, Charles was concerned about the safety of the journey, and thus had mustered the largest army he could, 12,000 troops, to escort him to Reims. The size of the French army, along with Joan's hallowed reputation, ensured that the Dauphin met little resistance on the march, although the town of Troyes was initially unwilling to submit to the Armagnacs, relenting after days of negotiation and threats from Joan and Charles. And on the 16th of July, the inhabitants of Châlons, a town just 25 miles south of Reims, wrote to the city that they had decided to receive Charles as their sovereign, and that the people of Reims should do the same. Later, on the 16th of July, Charles and Joan rode through the gates of Reims to a jubilant reception, and the next day the Dauphin was crowned as Charles VII of France in the cathedral and anointed with the sacred oil of Clovis, whilst Joan stood near to him throughout the ceremony, holding her white banner. And after the ceremony, Joan knelt at Charles's feet and said, "Noble King, God's will is done." 2 months later, Joan and the French forces would attempt to take Paris by besieging it, However, this proved to be unsuccessful, as the Parisians refused to abandon their loyalty to the regent of France, and Joan led a failed assault on the walls of the city between the Porte Saint-Henri and the Porte Saint-Denis on the 8th of September, when she was wounded in the thigh by a crossbow and left lying in the open until nightfall. And although the Dauphinist cause remained in the ascendancy with high morale following Charles's coronation, this setback outside Paris shattered the Maid of Orleans' legend of invincibility. After a short truce between the English and the French, hostilities resumed in May of 1430, in which Joan was involved in the defence of a town west of Reims, known as Compiègne, from a joint English-Burgundian siege, when on the 24th of May, Joan took part in an attempted attack on the Burgundian camp on the northern outskirts of the town. However, the attack was discovered by the enemy, leading to the French attempting to flee. But the gates of Compiègne were then closed, either in panic or as an act of betrayal, before Joan could enter the city, and in the fighting, she was pulled from her horse by an archer and taken into captivity. The maid was taken to the Burgundian castle of Beaurevoir, and after several escape attempts, one of which involved Joan jumping 70 feet from a tower into a muddy moat, she was transferred to Arras, where the Burgundians and the English came to an agreement to exchange her for a pro-Burgundian nobleman and the sum of 10,000 livres tournois, which was one of the currencies used in France during the time. And so now that she was in English hands, Joan was taken to Rouen, which was the Duke of Bedford's headquarters, where she was then locked in an octagonal cell in chains, with only a small archer slit to allow light into her chambers. Joan was then placed on trial for heresy in a church court by both French collaborators, loyal to the English, and pro-English Burgundian clerics and lawyers led by Bishop Pierre Cauchon. This was because the English did not want to place her on trial themselves, because it would have been seen as a propaganda coup for Charles VII's cause. Therefore, having French and Burgundians oversee her trial was preferable. From the 9th of January until the 29th of May 1431, Joan was subjected to carefully constructed cross-examinations, which were intended to expose her as a witch and acolyte of the devil, instead of the saint and servant of God she claimed to be. Indeed, if the prosecutors were successful in proving Joan's heresy, it would also prove that Charles VII had claimed the French throne aided by the forces of darkness, which would therefore invalidate his legitimacy. The subject of the trial of Joan of Arc, and the numerous cross-examinations she was placed under, is a complex and lengthy subject, but essentially, over the course of 15 sessions or hearings from the 21st of February 1431 to the 17th of March, Joan was interrogated about her visions, the voices she reported to hear, and later her cross-dressing as a man, an act that was deeply shocking in 15th century Europe. True to Joan's character, she conducted herself with intelligence and composure throughout the hearings, but at one point during the third session was asked a trick question. Do you know whether or not you are in God's grace? This was a trap, as if Joan had said no, she would in effect have been admitting she was a sinner. But if she had said yes, she would have been claiming to know God's will, which was seen as an equally abominable sin. Her answer goes to illustrate the clarity of mind which Joan possessed, truly remarkable considering that she was an illiterate daughter of a French peasant. If I am not in God's grace, she replied, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me. I should be the saddest creature in the world if I knew I were not in his grace. Time and again, Joan answered questions in such a way that outwitted her prosecutors, which is also remarkable to say the least, considering that she was being interrogated by men who were far better educated than herself in law, theology, and politics. However, Cauchon was a skilled interrogator, and gradually he extracted more and more information from Joan, including stories of visions that she had never previously divulged. One such vision was that at Chinon, after meeting Charles VII, angels had delivered a golden crown that only Joan could see to the king. And this was a damning claim in Cauchon's eyes, as he was an expert theologian and knew that it was widely accepted within the church that angels or saints did not take physical form, staying instead in the spiritual realm, whilst demons and devils could manipulate physical objects to tempt a would-be sinner. Joan was highly capable and steadfast in her own defense, but she could not know the complexities of theological thinking of the time, and she was steadily and remorselessly questioned on numerous occasions in order to extract as much damning information from her as possible. Bishop Cauchon then switched tack and questioned Joan about her cross-dressing in men's clothes when she had travelled through France in disguise to meet the Dauphin Charles. Joan had also continued to wear men's clothes and cut her hair short during her campaign, and Cauchon asked her if God had commanded her to wear men's clothes, which is forbidden in the Bible, and Joan reacted by saying, "What concerns this dress is a small thing, less than nothing." This was not true in the eyes of the court, as the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament of the Bible clearly forbade men to wear women's clothes, and vice versa. This was important to Joan's interrogators, as how, they would argue, could Joan have been a divine agent of God if the Bible clearly forbade cross-dressing? This, as well as Joan's other evidence regarding her visions, was enough in the court's eyes to condemn the Maid of Orleans, and Joan was taken on the 24th of May 1431 to the scaffold next to the church of Saint-Ouen in Rouen, Normandy, where her sentence was to be read to her, and then she would be burned alive at the stake as a heretic. Joan had time and again stated that God would deliver her from her captors, but now facing a terrible, agonizing death, she retracted her claims of visions and submitted to the authority of the Holy Mother Church. She then signed a pre-written confession and recanted, which meant that Joan was admitting everything she had said and done over the previous years had not been inspired by divine intervention, but instead had been entirely of her own doing, thus meaning that God was not on France's side, and that Charles VII's coronation was null and void. Cauchon then read out a different sentence, in which Joan was to spend the rest of her life in prison rather than being burned, and she was taken back to her cell and took off her male clothing in exchange for a dress. This should have been the end of her story, but 4 days later, Cauchon was informed that Joan had once again put on male clothing, which in effect made her confession null and void. Joan appeared highly confused when questioned by Cauchon, and it was later suggested that after she had put on women's clothes, she'd been assaulted or raped in her cell by the guards, which is a distinct possibility. Above all, Joan was in a state of despair, given that she had recanted and, in her eyes, abandoned God. She also claimed that God had visited her and told her that she had damned her soul to save her life, and she also stated that she only recanted to save herself from the fire. These statements were fatal in Cauchon's eyes, and he immediately ordered her execution. Joan of Arc was then tied to a stake on a tall pier and burned alive in Rouen on the 30th of May 1431, aged just 19. She died crying the name of Jesus, and after her body had been reduced to a charred corpse, her remains were burnt twice more. To prevent her remains being collected as relics, her ashes were then thrown into the River Seine. After Joan's death, Charles VII of France gradually retook the north of the country, and the English were further weakened both by Charles resolving his differences with Philip, Duke of Burgundy, in 1435, resulting in them forming an alliance against the English, and the death of the Duke of Bedford in the same year. This was despite Henry VI of England being crowned King of France himself, aged just 10 years old, in 1431. But without the Duke of Bedford to lead his forces, England's hopes of maintaining its French territories were, in effect, non-existent. They would never again have the unity or power to undertake large-scale campaigns in France, as the infighting over the English crown in the War of the Roses kept their attention firmly on domestic affairs. The English crown would maintain its claim over France until the Peace of Amiens in 1802, and its last bastion in the country, Calais, fell to the French during the reign of Mary I, over 100 years after Joan's death. France had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat in the 100 Years' War, and the undoubtable spark that lit the fire of French resistance against their enemies when the Dauphin's cause was at its lowest ebb, and the Anglo-Burgundian supremacy seemed assured, was a peasant girl from Domremy, known as Joan of Arc. 25 years after her execution, a posthumous retrial was held, in which Joan was found not guilty of heresy by the papacy, and in 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, she was made a saint. But regardless of whether Joan of Arc's visions actually took place, there is little doubt that without her, The French attempts to relieve the siege at Orleans may very well have failed, and with it, possibly French hopes of winning the 100 Years' War. No one can deny that for a teenage peasant girl to rise to the prominence that Joan did, and to be one of the crucial factors in the turning of French fortunes in the 100 Years' War, is a truly amazing feat. And her continued fame and iconic status throughout the world is testament to her achievements in life, and Joan is undoubtedly the most famous and influential figure to emerge from the entire conflict. Whether Joan really did receive divine messages and visions is a matter of debate. Indeed, her life is still widely debated and argued over today. But whatever the truth of her claims, Joan of Arc was a truly inspirational and brave young woman who did extraordinary things in a time when female power largely revolved around the formation of marriages and the production of male heirs, rather than the bold, independent, political and military leadership that Joan displayed. Furthermore, the few medieval exceptions to this in Western Europe, such as Eleanor of Aquitaine or Isabella of France, were nobles and queens, rather than ordinary peasants like Joan. It is one of history's greatest wonders that an illiterate French peasant girl played such a major role in the outcome of one of the longest, hardest fought, and bloodiest wars in medieval European history, and it is hard not to feel a great sense of admiration, along with a tinge of sadness, that such a young medieval woman could achieve so much in such a short space of time, and yet still suffer such an agonizing and terrible death. What do you think of Joan of Arc? Was she a mere peasant girl and religious heretic who interfered in matters which should not have concerned her? Or was she an inspirational miracle worker who snatched victory from the jaws of defeat and set her country on the path to salvation in the 100 Years' War? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.